IVM.
I want to thank Intel for supporting our show. We're all loving working from home, but let's be honest, there are complications. For example, getting help from IT folks if your PC is down can be challenging because you can't just walk up to them anymore. Well, you'll be happy to hear that I have a solution for you, the Intel vPro platform. The platform comes packed with Intel Active Management technology that lets your IT teams remotely manage your systems and fix the problems without having to go to them. So it means more time getting your work done and less time spent on getting support. Visit intel.in/morewithvpro, that's VPRO, to discover how you can do more of what you want and less of what you don't. If you're listening on the IVM Podcast Android app, click the link that's visible to you now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. On the 23rd of May, 1592, a giant armada of hundreds of Japanese ships appeared on the coast of southern Korea. The Japanese army on board these vessels had an incredibly ambitious goal. They were going to conquer Korea and then use it as a base to conquer Ming China itself, one of the most powerful states in the world. You know, sometimes in All Things Policy, we like to step back from the day-to-day issues of public policy and try and get a little bit of perspective about the world. And today we're going to look at the Imjin War, Japan's invasions of Korea from 1592 to 1598, and how influential this war has been even today. And to discuss this with me, I have Anirudh Kanisetti and my fellow Aditya Parikh. Now, both of them have been reading Samuel Hawley's book, The Imjin War, which I think we'll all very highly recommend to our listeners. But I want to start with you, Anirudh. You've completed this book and you've actually put down some thoughts of yours on slides and so on. I want you to first lay down the context. Why on earth was Japan, this small island country, really a confederation of daimyos, in 1592, trying to invade Korea and China?
So the 16th and 17th century history of Japan is like absolutely fascinating, Aditya. As you said, it's kind of dominated by these feudal warlords, these daimyos, who I think can really, who really stand out as very vivid characters because of kind of the corpus of oral and written legends that kind of arose up around them. And the fact that Japan was a fairly literate sort of society then leaves us with a great deal of records to kind of reconstruct the military and political history of Japan at the time and the way that was transformed by the introduction of new forces, especially gunpowder. So Japan historically has not really been a single united country, much as it likes to pretend otherwise. For most of its history, it was kind of shattered into a series of small feuding principalities over which the imperial center at Kyoto exerted some degree of control, usually not very much, especially as you go towards the smaller islands within the Japanese archipelago. So what happens roughly around the 16th century is that the balance of power shifts quite alarmingly in favor of these smaller daimyos as opposed to the imperial center at Tokyo, which leads to a huge number of them trying to make a bid to become the dominant one by defeating the others in war. As you can imagine, initially the whole thing isn't really very decisive. It's a supremely bloody conflict, kind of immortalized even today in a lot of great Japanese cinema, especially the work of Akira Kurosawa. But one thing that really changes the entire balance of power and introduces a really frightening and dynamic energy to the entire conflict is the arrival of the Portuguese selling gunpowder weaponry. And gunpowder weaponry immediately catches on with these daimyos who understand very well the military applications of it. It's an interesting parallel, but also a contrast to the way that Indian states were kind of looking at gunpowder. Whereas in the Deccan, which was another one of the world's most militarily dynamic regions, you see that most of the sultanates especially tend to focus on the use of gunpowder in artillery to kind of defend their forts, and to a lesser extent field artillery. But they're not really that interested in kind of musketry and like infantry that are wielding guns. Even in Europe itself, right? Europe, even though it occupies like a disproportionate space in the popular military historical consciousness, Europe itself was still very much on its way to eventually becoming like a gunpowder superpower. Europe in the 16th century was dominated by formations that we call pike and shot, where you would have some number of guys with guns, but a large number of guys with pikes who would kind of hold off cavalry trying to attack these guys with guns. And the guys with guns would usually be expected to kind of provide their own armament. So all of their guns would be from different gunsmiths. All of these guns would have like different calibers, so the ammunition wasn't interchangeable. So there really wasn't a lot of standardization to the European army. In contrast, Japanese armies of the 16th century were absolutely fearsome and likely the most efficient gunpowder wielding armies at the time, like really kind of preceding Europe by almost 150 to 100 years. The daimyo lords had figured out how to deploy infantry wielding guns in their front lines. One really great example is the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, which is just 10 years after the Battle of Talikota, which in the Deccan established the supremacy of gunpowder over cavalry. Similarly, the Battle of Nagashino in Japan established the supremacy of gunpowder wielded by well-trained warriors of peasant origin against these highly trained samurai warriors of aristocratic origin. And because of the successful deployment of this kind of guns, a couple of warlords, first Oda Nobunaga and then Toyotomi Hideyoshi, eventually managed to extend their control over the entire Japanese archipelago and over all of its kind of arrogant and powerful warlords. Now, as you can imagine, keeping control of all these proud men is really not an easy task. And Hideyoshi himself was a man of a fairly humble origins who had literally fought his way up the ranks from being the son of a peasant farmer to being essentially the military dictator of all Japan. And Hideyoshi needed a way to kind of keep all these daimyo under him busy. And the method that he kind of settled on to actually do this was by sending a massive army of all these daimyos to invade Korea and eventually hack a way through to China. Now, it appears that Hideyoshi had a very good sense of how outdated the militaries of China and Korea were at this time. Plus, he also had a great deal of regard for himself, as a lot of successful conquerors tend to do. So what Hideyoshi really wanted to do was twofold. He wanted not only to keep the warlords under him busy, but he also wanted to take over areas that he saw as militarily weak, ripe for the taking, use their wealth to kind of fuel his own war machine, and establish his dynasty of humble origins, the Toyotomi, as the most powerful in not just all of Japan, but all of Asia itself.
All right, Anirudh. So it seems like we have this megalomaniac ruler in Japan. And this is a man whose ambitions obviously know no limits. What is interesting is how he goes about this planned conquest of East Asia. He knows that his ships can't necessarily span the waters all the way to the coasts of China. And so he decides to use Korea as his staging post for this conquest into China, march north across the Yalu River, enter China proper. This sounds like an incredibly ambitious, frankly, even foolhardy plan. And it's not terribly surprising, spoiler alert, that this didn't work. But Anirudh, can you just run us through broadly both the land campaign and the sea campaign that followed? When this giant Japanese armada showed up on the southern coast of Korea, what happened next?
Yeah, it is really quite an audacious plan if you actually sit and think about it. And the thing is, the really strange thing to me is that by all accounts, it could actually have worked if only the Koreans were not as foolhardy in their defiance of the Japanese as they actually were. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. So broadly, the way that the invasion was planned was that it would use the island of Tsushima, which now is most famous for being the site of the blockbuster PS4 video game Ghost of Tsushima, which I've been playing. It's awesome, but it's really, really historically inaccurate. Tsushima was basically used as a staging point. 3 massive invading armies, each led by a daimyo or a feudal warlord who's very close to Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And all of these men kind of have their own personal rivalries, as you can imagine, and all of them want to capture Korean cities as quickly as they can and force the Koreans to surrender and open up the gates to China, as it were, as soon as they possibly can. And in the initial weeks of the campaign, it really seemed like this very calculated rivalry, which Hideyoshi obviously understood and deliberately used to guide his choice of commanders, was really working. because within the space of no less than 3 weeks, what little Korean armies could be put into the field were absolutely smashed. People in forts that refused to surrender to the Japanese were absolutely slaughtered. Cities were sacked, surrounded, and absolutely the Koreans were outgunned, outmaneuvered by the Japanese infantry and by the Japanese cavalry. And the sense overall in Korea was like of absolute pessimism. There was no idea how on earth they could potentially defeat the Japanese and how on earth they could save the tens of thousands of peasants who are now at the mercy of the Japanese. But the Japanese just continued to push on. Within a matter of 3 weeks, as I said, they managed to capture Seoul, the Korean capital. The Korean king was forced to flee north to Pyongyang. And Pyongyang also itself was soon captured by the Japanese, and the king had to flee once again further into the north. And the Japanese were so audacious that they managed to attack the northeast, the distant northeast of Korea as well, capture most of it, which left them with the string of towns broadly stretching from the southeast of Korea all the way to the northwest and to the northeast. But surprisingly enough, the Koreans absolutely refused to surrender. They genuinely saw the Japanese as being inferior barbarians who were not cultured Neo-Confucians like themselves, and they saw it almost as a matter of duty to not allow the Japanese to attack their overlords, the sovereign powers of the Ming dynasty. So very soon after that, you start to see the rise of Korean guerrilla warriors who began to kind of attack the stretched out Japanese supply lines. Now, of course, as you can imagine, the Japanese were not militarily incompetent. They had thought about the potential of this kind of thing happening. So they tried to terrify the population into silence by widespread slaughter and the committing of absolutely barbaric atrocities. But this had the kind of paradoxical effect of only making resistance even stronger. Soon it became very obvious that the Chinese forces, especially in Pyongyang and in Seoul, which were very far away from the east coast, desperately needed reinforcements and needed supplies, which meant the Japanese had to get into the Yellow Sea and kind of deliver supplies and reinforcements to them through ships by traversing along Korea's rivers. And the Japanese on paper looked like they had a very, very powerful armada. It was, by all accounts, composed of hundreds of ships. Each of these ships basically acted as a massive mobile platform for gunpowder-wielding soldiers. But they were stopped in their tracks by quite possibly one of the most remarkable military commanders at sea that humanity has ever seen, a middle-aged chap called Admiral Yi Sun-sin. Now, Admiral Yi was a guy who hadn't had a lot of success in the Korean military. He had a reputation as somebody who saw a lot of value in the military, unlike most of the Neo-Confucian bureaucracy, which kind of lorded it over him. And he was also a kind of guy who wouldn't stand for corruption or incompetence among his superiors or his inferiors, which didn't really win him a lot of friends. Through a series of kind of coincidences, the guy ended up in control of one of the fleets that was based in southwest Korea. And even though he was basically abandoned by the central government, which was, as you can imagine, a total panic and kind of alternated between it, which in the months before the Japanese invasion kind of alternated between dismissing them as a threat and hyperventilating about them, he managed to kind of scrounge together the resources to rebuild a lot of ships, get new ships, and commission new weaponry, especially artillery, which was something that the Koreans were better than the Japanese in. And he's especially well known for his deployment of something called a turtle ship, which is basically an armored battleship that kind of floats very low in the water and has two decks, one for rowers being below and the one for cannoneers being above. So Yi Sun-sin kind of deploys his artillery to remarkable effect against the Japanese ships. So even though he's very often outnumbered 2 or 3 to 1, he managed to take down a lot of Japanese ships with minimal losses on his side, which totally puts an end to any Japanese ambitions of kind of getting into the Yellow Sea and reinforcing their forces in Pyongyang and Seoul. And this, in combination with the stretching out of their supply lines because of Korean guerrilla activity and the eventual arrival of Ming Chinese forces, meant that within a few months after the invasion started, it became very obvious that the Japanese were not going to be able to hold on to Korea. And even though the war continued on and off for quite a few years after that, the Japanese were now consistently on the back foot. And even though there were some pretty horrifying atrocities and victories by them against the Koreans, the overall balance of power shifted very decisively in favor of the Korean-Chinese alliance. And Toyotomi Hideyoshi's interests also kind of faded. His interest in Korea began to fade as he realized how difficult it was going to be to conquer it, which eventually brought a war to one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. Estimates range that almost 2 million Koreans, or about 25% of the population, either died or were forced into slavery. It basically bankrupted the Ming dynasty of China to send troops to fight the Japanese. That bankruptcy in turn led to the invasion of China by a nomadic group of people called the Jurchen or the Manchu, who eventually founded the Qing Empire, which was the last imperial dynasty that ruled China before the advent of the People's Republic.
Even by the standards of the 16th century, the events of the Imjin War, and especially of 1592, are absolutely extraordinary. The sheer brutality, Anirudh, as you said, of this war, the lightning speed of the Japanese invasion, the way they moved, the one-sided nature of so many of the initial land battles and sieges, and even when the Japanese were on the back foot, when the Chinese had come in to intervene, they actually managed to defeat the Chinese once to buy themselves time. I mean, it's extraordinary, and you have to really give it to both the persistence of the Chinese, but also the constant guerrilla campaign within the Korean Peninsula, and of course, Admiral Yi's amazing naval offensive for really turning things around. Obviously, a war on such a scale is going to leave its mark on all of these civilizations, really, the cultures of Japan, of Korea, and of China. How is it remembered, especially in Korea, where this was most devastating?
So what is really fascinating to me is the extent to which this kind of 16th century conflict shapes Korean national consciousness today. And I think there's an interesting parallel once again to the Deccan and to South India, right? Because especially in Karnataka where we live, there's a tendency to think of the Battle of Talikota as a kind of turning point of sorts, especially among those who kind of prefer a somewhat religiously tinted interpretation of 16th century history. The Battle of Talikota is seen as a victory of these basically barbaric people, these evil Deccan sultans who used gunpowder to defeat the glorious Vijayanagara Empire and horribly sack it. Now, the evidence to that is really kind of mixed. It is really not as one-sided as it's often made out to be. And rather than seeing this victory as a result of two kind of clashing military systems, which eventually ended in both sides losing out horribly, it's kind of seen as as a moment of national unity and heroism, as anachronistic as these concepts might be for the 16th century. That's how it's seen. And a lot of the elements are very similar. They kind of draw on the same kind of similar nationalist myths, particularly of the great, noble, manly, virile general, Admiral Yi Sun Sin. You kind of see a similar virile, manly, noble interpretation attached to characters such as Maharana Pratap, even though we don't know anywhere near about as much about Maharana Pratap as we do about Yi Sun Sin. You also see the existence of the trope of the violated and heroic women. In Korea, for example, the Japanese in the Imjin War seized a city called Chinju and absolutely slaughtered every man, woman, and child in there. A courtesan is supposed to have kind of seduced a Japanese samurai, grabbed him, and jumped off the walls in a kind of expression of her nationalist character. This is quite similar, once again, to the way that myths about a Johar are kind of discussed, rather than being about a particular kind of cultural construct as being kind of sign of how great and glorious and chivalrous women used to be and how interested they were in defending their honor. Obviously the flip side of that argument being that modern women are not interested in doing that and are not as sanskari, for lack of a better word, as their ancestors. If you look at a lot of the memorials that you see in Korea, especially to the Imjin War, the Japanese are depicted as nothing more than subhuman barbarians. And once again, there's a parallel to Hindutva nationalist discourse in the way that Muslim invasions are talked about. Even if a Muslim state has been in India for centuries, and even if its rulers are all mostly Indian by blood, they are still depicted somehow as subhuman invaders who absolutely cannot be tolerated, absolutely cannot be lived with, which flies, of course, in the face of centuries of coexistence.
And yes, and this has also been memorialized in films, hasn't it, Aditya?
Yeah, in 2014, a movie called The Admiral, Roaring Currents came out, and it was received by critics with lauding applause. But, it was accused of being overly nationalistic in Korea by certain circles. And although a film of this genre, this kind, it is pretty historically accurate as well. However, some liberties were indeed taken. And for example, there is an incident about there being a fist fight in the middle of the battle. But that actually didn't happen with Admiral Yi. A different naval commander in that battle had that happen to his ship. So there are liberties being taken with this film, but there's also a character in the movie called Junsa, who's a confidant of Admiral Yi. He was a Hangwei. It literally means surrendered soldiers. So these people were surrendered soldiers who were ethnically Japanese. So they were working for the Joseon Navy. So people who were not exactly participating in battles, but were employed as people who were in a subsidiary role. So during the battles. So, for example, they were lookouts for the fleet. They were cannon loaders, that sort of a thing. And honestly, this movie really did justice to Admiral Yi, but I wouldn't say that it wasn't really affected by the jingoistic Korean soul of our times, I would say. So I was wondering, Anirudh, Sam Hawley makes an argument about the tactics that Hideyoshi used to control his daimyos, even when he was just unifying Japan. But he did have plans to, in the future, lead a war of conquest abroad. So would you give us a brief picture of that?
Sure. So I kind of briefly mentioned how for like a lot of Hideyoshi's overall strategy was really about trying to get his hands on as much wealth as he possibly could to kind of redistribute it to his daimyos. One integral part of Hideyoshi's entire strategy was to absolutely smash those who defied him, but heartily reward those who went along with what he wanted to do. You can see that in the way that he went about conquering Japan. In a sharp contrast to his predecessor, Oda Nobunaga, what Hideyoshi used to do was rather than absolutely slaughter as many enemies as he possibly could, he'd kind of try to overawe them with a show of force. And he would very publicly make it clear that those who surrendered to him would get much, much larger dominions and much more wealth than they had hitherto been accustomed to. One really great example is the Shimizu family, which dominated the island of Kyushu, which is one of the larger islands in the westernmost part of the Japanese archipelago. The Shimizu initially kind of defied Hideyoshi, which very soon led to him invading with an army of really nearly 200,000, if I'm not wrong. And within the space of a few months, overawing them into submission and then rewarding them for quickly submitting and not extending the war with a lot of money and quite considerable revenue assignments. So broadly, a strategy for his daimyo, especially if you look at the ones who are fighting in Korea, these are all guys who came primarily from the western parts of Japan, who had like holdings there. And his basic idea was that, look, you guys invade Korea, you get to keep the revenues of Korea. The Koreans are going to surrender to me, and I'm going to make the Korean army go and invade China, and they get to keep a large part of China for themselves. So really the way that he thinks about it is that it's kind of like a domino effect, where people further and further away gain a lot of money from like actually working with him, and so continue to kind of go along with his plans for expansion. And his idea was that he would appoint these men to like these proud, ambitious men to positions of great profit, but always be overseeing them and be the dominant kind of political force within his empire. I hope that answers your question.
I just briefly want to add one more point. I think Sam Hawley makes this point that Hideyoshi made sure to separate the original dominion of the daimyo from him, so that any allegiances he might have accumulated in his time of solely ruling over those people would be washed away, and he wouldn't really have any ground support there, any grassroots support there. So he wielded absolute power that way.
Agreed. And that's something that you actually see in a lot of early modern states. You see it reflected in Akbar's Mansabdari system in the Mughal Empire, for example. To an extent, you also see it reflected with Krishnadevaraya's polygarch system in the Vijayanagara Empire. And even before that, like if you look at the Delhi Sultanate, for example, and even the later Deccan Sultanates, you see all of them kind of rely on warlords who are of slave origin, military slaves who basically come from abroad, who have absolutely no connection to the land, and therefore are seen as being more loyal to the center of power than they otherwise would have been. So Hideyoshi isn't really remarkable in that sense. But yeah, that's something he definitely did do.
Yeah, all of these warlords were obsessed with what we would now call coup-proofing, basically ensuring that there is some sort of royal guard or some sort of military force that will be unquestionably loyal only to them. I will just conclude by saying thank you, guys. I mean, Hideyoshi must be one of the most transformative figures of the 16th century, and there are so many of them. This man changed the course of history in Japan, in Korea, and China. He was a small man, probably only 5'1", and he really was such a transformative figure. Thank you so much for joining us, Anirudh and Aditya.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you like this sort of content, do check out a podcast that Anirudh and I host called Yuddha. Also, if you'd like to hear more on topics like this, let us know on social media or by email, and we'll be happy to do more such episodes. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Intel, for coming back to us. We love our sponsors. If you'd like to be one of them, do reach out. So really cool week on the network this week, right? Started off with a bang. Abhijit Ganguly was on Cyrus Says. Funny comedian. I think you guys will enjoy that. We had Dimant Parekh on advertising his death. Dimant's the founder of Better India. Govindraj Athiraj is also on Uncle Please Sit this week. That's a really fascinating show which they talk about fake news. On the Habit Coach, there was a crossover event with Aditi Surana from Absolutely Right. I think you definitely enjoyed that. And last but not least, definitely a show I'd love you all to check out. We have a new show called This Round Is On Me. It's hosted by Gauri Devi Dayal. If you remember, Gauri and I worked on a show together called The Kolaba Cartel a while ago. Fun show. If you haven't checked that out, do check that out. But this is a show where she's talking to a lot of different people in the food space. Her first guest is Harsh Mariwala, legend in his own time. I think you'll really enjoy that show. But with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story-sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Storysellers for personal stories, analysis and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.